Spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus again, in reply, spoke to the chief priests and elders of the people in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast, but they refused to come. A second time he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those invited, behold, I have prepared my banquet, my calves and fattened cattle are killed, and everything is ready. Come to the feast.' Some ignored the invitation and went away, one to his farm, another to his business. The rest laid hold on his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged and sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy to come. Go out, therefore, into the main roads and invite to the feast whomever you find.' The servants went out into the streets and gathered all they found, bad and good alike, and the hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to meet the guests, he saw a man there not dressed in a wedding garment. The king said to him, 'My friend, how is it that you came in here without a wedding garment?' But he was reduced to silence. Then the king said to his attendants, 'Bind his hands and feet and cast him into the darkness outside, where there will be wailing and grinding of teeth. Many are invited, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord. To make an offer implies leaving people free to take up the offer or not, to accept the invitation or not. An offer or an invitation that cannot be refused is not an offer or an invitation in any true sense of the word. The parable in today's gospel reading tells the story of a king who offered an invitation of his son's wedding feast that was refused by many. In that culture, people normally received two invitations to a feast: an initial invitation sometime before the event, and a second invitation just as the meal was ready. To refuse the second invitation at the point when the meal was all prepared, having already said yes to the first invitation, would have been a great insult to the host. In this second invitation that people decline in the parable that we have just heard, those who had invited and had accepted the invitation were called at the table just as the food was about to be served, and they said no thanks. Some of them in a very violent fashion. The equivalent experience today might be someone who had accepted an invitation to a meal in a friend's house, and then, just 10 minutes before the meal is due to start runs up and says he or she will not be able to come after all. The host might have second thoughts about asking the person around again. In the parable, the king who invites people to the wedding feast of his son is an image of God who invites people to gather around his son, Jesus. John Baptist once referred to himself as the friend of the bridegroom. God invites all of us to become friends of Jesus, the bridegroom, to enter into communion with him, and then to live out our communion with him. This is the great Christian calling, the great invitation that God extends to all men and women. The fact that this calling is expressed in the term of an invitation to a wedding feast suggests that there is a real celebratory element to this calling. It is a call to joy, the deep-seated joy that comes from knowing that God values us so much that He desperately wants us to be present at His Son's great feast. There is joy at the heart of Christian life. Life, death, and resurrection of Jesus give us something to celebrate, even when life is going against us. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection proclaim the good news that God's mercy is stronger than our sins, that God's life is stronger than our various experience of death, that God's power is stronger than our weakness. We can each say with Saint Paul in today's second reading from his letter to the Philippians, "There is nothing I cannot master with the help of the one who gives me strength." Paul wrote that letter from his prison cell. He had been through great hardship and he suspected that worse was to come. And yet, that little letter is full of joy. Even though it was written out of a real Calvary experience, it radiates the light of Easter. We always live and walk in the light of Easter, even in our darkest moments. The Christian calling is always a calling to joyful and hopeful living. That joyful, hopeful living that God calls us to is not a way of life that leaves us self-satisfied or smug. An authentically joyful and hopeful life will always overflow into the service of others. In carrying the joy and hope of the gospel in our hearts, we are moved to bring joy where there is sadness, to bring hope where there is despair, to bring courage to the fearful, companionship to the lonely, acceptance to those who have experienced rejection. This is the significance of the wedding garment that is referred to in the parable of today's gospel reading. Those who have accepted the king's invitation to his son's wedding feast must dress accordingly, must live accordingly. The king who invites people to his son wedding feast in today's parable from Matthew Gospel says to those same people in another parable a little later in Matthew's Gospel, I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me something to drink, a stranger and you welcomed me, sick and you took care of me. Each day we are invited to taste the joy and the hope of the gospel for ourselves and to become messengers of that joy and hope to others. The Eucharist is a foretaste of the great wedding banquet of Christ in the kingdom of heaven to which God invites us. At the Eucharist, we renew our joyful hope and we commit ourselves again to the joyful and hopeful service of others.